they have this very, very interesting phenomenon where when they tap into the part of their meditation that is, I guess I would say, highly energetic, that is very part of that, that Kriya Yoga, that energy up the spine into the brain and then up and above and beyond. And that coincides with this big high beta gamma spike as well, which is something that is not really seen in a lot of people in really any kind of capacity. It was something that, we looked at as neuroscientists and we're like, what on earth is going on? And so actually these high-end meditators, they're basically like, the Olympians of the neural world, to where their brain is extremely kind of toned up, and a bit, it gives them this ability to not only have excellent and very interesting things happen during their meditation, but it actually leads to their brains being different throughout the whole rest of their kind of waking or resting lives. But we're really just now getting to grips with the fact that this high gamma thing does exist, and neuroscientists are now really getting to grips with meditation and finding out that it is this extremely significant way of altering your internal physiology, especially the nature of your brain.
Hey everybody, welcome to Techforpsych, where we combine the latest neurotechnology with ancient wisdom to supercharge your brain. I'm Dr. Cody Rall, your medical doctor confidant. Today we're talking to neuroscientist Kiefer O'Sullivan, who has a wealth of knowledge and a range of experiences. He's worked in academia as well as private industry, working for health and wellness clinics that want to collect and publish their own neuroscience data. Kiefer's worked with a range of different equipment to include the Muse Headband, do-it-yourself at-home EEG technology, as well as gold standard EEG technology, laboratory equipment that costs tens of thousands of dollars. So it was great to talk to him about the limitations of things like the Muse Headband compared to the gold standard technology and what we might be missing in terms of data. In the same thread, we talked about taking a look at expert level meditators and what in their brain data actually is interesting, to include gamma wave bursts, alpha peak wave frequency, as well as other characteristics that I think you'll find really interesting. So stick around. So Kiefer O'Sullivan, you're a neuroscientist, and you're part of the Heart Mind Alchemy group, a group that's doing really awesome things in my opinion. You guys are such an awesome mastermind group, shading this knowledge, building up this data set of meditation, neurofeedback, brain waves, all these type of things. I wanted to start, and I recently watched a video that you did with Holly Copeland in which you dove deep down into her EEG data, and I thought it was just so great. And there were so many concepts there that I wanted to ask you about on this interview. But what I wanted to start with was if you could give our audience just a little bit of your background and where you come from, and how you do actually enter into this space of neurofeedback, EEG meditation, and brain scans and all that.
Absolutely. And so my journey into this whole kind of meditation, brainwave, neurofeedback, neurotech kind of field was what I like to call like a very long but inevitable kind of road. I started, at a very young age. I was always interested in consciousness and what makes what we see real. Like, what is this reality? How does our brain interface with what is out there to create what we think actually is? And so from a very young age, I used to think like, oh, there must be like parts of a watch, like cogs and screws and things in somebody's head that would make that work. And for my whole life, I basically, that set me on the biology track. And so I went through, biology my whole life, undergrad. My university didn't offer a neuroscience degree, and so I actually had the opportunity to develop my own neuroscience degree. And then after that, I went and got my master's in biomedical science, focusing in neuroscience. And so historically, from my academic perspective, I did a lot of work in kind of pathology and stuff like that. So I worked a lot with, I did a thesis in novel chemotherapeutic agents in the treatment of glioma. So basically kind of medicinal chemistry and brain tumors. From there, I moved on to more kind of Parkinson's disease. And so, neural degeneration and kind of what happens when parts of the brain start to degrade. Why do they degrade? And so I spent a lot of time diving deep into the cellular and molecular nature of the brain, how it works, what are its individual components. And alongside that, kind of in parallel to that, I'd been a long-term meditator. And so personally, meditation had been something that, besides being interested in consciousness from that academic point of view, I moved to the United States from Ireland in 2013, I believe it was. No, 2007, actually. Where's my brain today? And coming from one country to another was a pretty big transition. I was actually 16 at the time, which was a pretty big, right in the middle of that high school, secondary school. And so it was kind of tough to make that transition just quite immediately and immediately feel comfortable and stuff like that. I was more of a bookish sort of character, let's say, not a socialite. And so meditation was something for me that was tremendous at abating anxiety and really just calming myself and getting myself into, it was almost at that physiological immediate treatment of, oh, I'm upset or I'm anxious, and then you can immediately tone that down. And for the longest time, my ambition had been to unify that with my academic career. But unfortunately, historically, meditation now is increasingly well funded, but historically in the past, it carried a stigma of being almost like this weird, people call it a woo-woo thing of oh, it's this fuzzy, soft, almost non-real, non-scientific thing, or almost anti-scientific. And so it was very hard to get funding for meditation studies and stuff like that. And so, after I finished off my thesis and kind of done a lot of my kind of hardcore academic work, I was like, no, this is it. This is where I really need to focus on what I think is a pivotal, aspect for future humanity to learn about and to learn from, to treat our own kind of mental health, our own physiological health. The stress that we put ourselves under is causing almost 60% of the disease that we see in the United States today. And so what more important for a biomedical scientist focusing in neuroscience than to take up this study of meditation, which is something that anybody can do. It's not expensive. You can do it at home, and it has tremendous physiological benefits. And so for the past several years now, I've been working with a lot of different companies, some different universities, a lot of different private corporations that do meditation studies, neurofeedback, mapping states of consciousness. How do you define states of consciousness? How do we, take somebody in and then say, oh, we're going to put you at X level, and you're going to get anxiety relief from that, really starting to put some of the qualitative and quantitative figures on this kind of meditation business. And so that's what I've been fortunate enough to be involved in the past couple of years. And then the last couple of years, most recently, is when I got involved with Stephen and Kevin and Holly with the Heart Mind Alchemy group, the Raising Our Vibration company, and doing a lot of that really, really interesting. I think you've spoken to Kevin and Stephen, and they have some really interesting brains. And so for me, with my desire to map those brainwave states, they offered some really, really fascinating data and fascinating perspectives. And I've learned so much from them and so many others that are in that community as well.
Yeah, I've already learned so much in just talking to them, just doing an interview and interacting on the Heart Mind Alchemy group. And one of the more interesting parts to me is, we've got on one side this consumer tech where it's amazing because people can enter so readily into taking a look at EEG and interacting with that, as well as other biometrics. But then on the other side, you've got academic, standardly trained individuals such as yourself that have a strong scientific background and have used sort of the more cutting edge equipment. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, because, you know, I'm a psychiatrist, I didn't go necessarily through the hardcore neuroscience route training. What is the hardware and the software that sort of constitutes gold standard EEG equipment, and how does that compare to where we're at right now with the Muse, and what kind of data is different between the two?
It's an excellent question, because there really is, you know, it's almost like comparing, you know, oranges and apples, right, with the Muse versus the other headsets. But that's not to say, you know, the Muse is bad, but there is a certain standard, right? So electrode count is one of the things that we look at. And so as EEG studies have kind of gone on and developed, and the technology has developed, electrode counts have increased. And so this gives you, you know, a number of benefits. One of the biggest ones is it gives you the ability to very much more spatially localize where something is happening. And so, you know, we know our brain is so dense with so many neurons and so many glial cells and so many networks and tracks and, you know, all kinds of different, you know, kind of currents and undercurrents that are going on. And there can be a very subtle difference between, you know, the mid part of your forehead and the left part or the right part, or even, you know, parts above and below that. And that can be different things where, you know, maybe one part is more tracked onto activity that's more, you know, attentional and more executive function, and the other part of the frontal is more working memory and stuff like that. And so you can imagine, you know, with Muse, you have just kind of maybe like the two frontal electrodes, and that gives you, okay, these are the frontal electrodes, these are the only frontal electrodes, these are the only electrodes that are close to that half of the skull, let's say. And so it gives you a very limited perspective on, okay, I'm seeing a signal. Is this signal coming from, is it coming from my eyes? Is it coming from my prefrontal, my frontal? Is it coming from temporal or central and kind of getting read? Because electrodes are very much like microphones, to where, you know, you can hold it up, but it's picking up sound from everywhere. And you can imagine, like, the more you have, the more you can say, oh, the signal is louder on this microphone, therefore I can very much say that this one alpha or theta or whatever it is very much localized into one, you know, very specific area. And then you can make even more complicated, you know, assertions over, oh, this person must be invoking some working memory task, or this person is getting cognitively fatigued, or something like that. And so the same.
Sorry to cut you off, but I think one of the most interesting examples you gave when you were talking with Holly on the video that I'm going to link on the description here is that when she was doing her Kriya Yoga technique and bringing, you know, that technique has to do with bringing this energy up through your spine and into the third eye. And part of that is your eye is kind of looking up, and there are these delta spikes that you get from that. I've seen them on my own mind monitor graph. And I just thought it was brilliant where you were able to point out, you know, although you might be getting increases in brain EEG signal, that delta is actually a very indicative of muscle contractions as well. Would you be able to go into that as a specific example with the delta increase?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, with the delta, it's an interesting thing, because that's a very, you know, it's almost a unique product of, you know, Muse's setup, kind of mind monitor, and how it does its FFT, the fast Fourier transform. Yeah. And so basically what it does is it'll take any electrical activity that is being read by Muse. You know, Muse doesn't know, you know, it's an electrical sensor, right? But it doesn't know what electricity comes from where. And there are all kinds of electrical things, you know, that are a part of your body, you know, so your facial nerves, for example, the nerves that control your jaw and your eyes moving up and down, left and right, blinking. Those are actually all controlled by different cranial nerves. Those cranial nerves have these powerful, kind of long, slow action potentials. So basically that means they have a very, like, powerful but slow electrical frequency that they're operating at. And so when that's very close to these kind of frontal electrodes that the Muse has, every time you blink, it's sending this long, slow, or it doesn't have to be a blink. You know, it could be a blink, an eye movement, a jaw movement, any facial scrunching, anything like that. Anytime that electrical signal is sent, it automatically propagates up through the face, through the scalp, gets picked up by the Muse, and then is jumbled in with every other electrical signal that it's picking up. And then it'll do that FFT where it breaks apart that complicated signal into its, you know, delta, theta, you know, alpha, beta, gamma. And it sees that slow wave coming from the eyes, doesn't know whether it's brain or not, but will take it in and go, oh, this appears as a delta wave. And so that's why people will get these, you know, big, you know, delta spikes, or you can even do it with, you know, Mind Monitor yourself, where, you know, just kind of hold your phone up and kind of watch the brain waves track, and then, you know, blink or move your eyes really suddenly, and then watch back at the screen real quick, and you'll see that delta does a big, big peak. And then you'll see that as well in a more long-term basis over people's graphs if they're doing something like, a lot of us move our eyes very subtly as we meditate or as we sleep or as we're just kind of at rest and stuff like that. If that becomes particularly kind of pronounced, you can kind of see it kind of rising over the course of a meditation. That will always coincide as well with the raw graph, so the raw electrical feed. You will typically, not always, but you will typically see the evidence of that being these much larger waveforms. Typically, let's just say brain or electrical activity of brain origin would be 10 to 20 microvolts of a deviation, kind of up and down. Typically, the hard standard is about 50 microvolts up and down. That's what a lot of, like, you know, view windows on an EEG program will set that, because anything beyond that is probably not brain at all, unless you're doing like a sleep study and you're looking at very deep delta waves, which are a different kind of thing. And so it's a very interesting thing how that gets pulled into the FFT, because the electrical activity is not unique to our brain, and so we have to be very cognizant of that when we're doing these studies. And that's always a huge factor for, you know, even, you know, Muse or not, you know, whether it's Muse or whether it's a $20,000 headset, those blinking artifacts, those jaw tension, neck tension, different facial movements, bodily movements are always going to be a factor. And so that's one of the biggest things you learn is, this is an eye movement, this is a jaw movement, this is what that looks like, this is what this looks like. And
and so with the higher end equipment, what about that equipment makes you better able to parse out what is actually brainwaves and what is artifacts like that? And
so part of that is the electrode number that I mentioned, and yep. So the layout as well can be important. In addition to the electrode, kind of the composition and the design of the electrode. So comparing, let's say, a very expensive headset to Muse, you know, we know Muse kind of has these kind of more broad electrodes. It's like a band, in addition to the conductive, very broad conductive silicone ones that go across the ears. The very high-end EEG systems that I use would have like almost like a little button-sized kind of electrode for each electrode site, and it's very kind of specific, it's very localized, it's very specific to that area of the brain. And so in addition to that, kind of going back to what I mentioned about the layout and the electrode numbers, so the eye movements are obviously going to be strongest from these two frontal electrodes, unfortunately the ones that Muse has only. But for example, if you had like a 32 electrode EEG set up and you had a whole bunch of frontal electrodes and then electrodes that span all the way back to the back of the head, and you're seeing a particularly weird interference signal, a weird, you know, high amplitude signal that you think is some kind of interference, you can go, okay, I think this is eye movement. Eye movement most strongest comes from FP1, FP2. So let me look and see if that signal lines up with that logically. Like, is this signal strongest from those electrodes? And then you can then take another analytical step beyond that to say, okay, there are some computations I can do where I can actually, compare the frontal electrodes that have the eye interference to maybe other frontal electrodes that don't have that interference. You can kind of subtract them and basically, try and quantify this is the level of interference. And then you can say, okay, cut that out, or here's this epoch where there's some interference and we can confirm it's interference. Let's just like cut that out of the analysis. And so it gets a lot more of that. It gives you a lot more flexibility of that fine tooth comb to be able to go in and be like, oh, I suspect this is non-neural data. I can then follow through and kind of prove that and show that that's valid. And so when you're going in for peer review and when you're going in for publication, or you're just going in for your own kind of logical like thought process, you can very much figure out this is definitely this is definitely brain, this is definitely not brain. But with the Muse, it can become very difficult to say this is 99% likely it's the non-neural data, but I don't have the ability as a scientist to work with that data enough to be able to say, yes, this is definitely eye data beyond a doubt, and I can therefore remove that and move on to the data that is good data. With the Muse, or just with anything with lowered electrode amounts, you just can't do that, because if the signal is bad from those electrodes, then, and you need to cut that out, which is a very common thing in all EEG studies, you're not left with anything of value. And so it can become very difficult of trying to get the best data possible in that scenario.
And to give Muse the benefit of the doubt, we are talking about Mind Monitor, which is kind of like the bare bones raw EEG third-party app. Do you think in the regular Muse software where they have the neurofeedback experience, they are doing some data filtering? Do you have any knowledge or opinion on that?
From what I understand about, so Muse is pretty, or Interaxon is pretty tight-lipped about kind of what's going on behind the scenes. Yeah. But from what I understand and my own kind of brainstorming is that for Muse, in the native Muse app, it doesn't need to necessarily track brainwaves very accurately. Because what it does is it takes that calibration beforehand, and so what it is doing, and it takes that calibration every single time that you are doing the session. And so what it's doing is that it's kind of comparing the signal, I think, in a more simplistic fashion to the baseline to see if there's some toning down. I don't know how much of an FFT they use, if they weigh alpha values or do like, theta beta ratio, or I don't know what they kind of do. And at the same time, I'll mention that, I do a lot of comparisons between, Muse is this, and then this other headset is this, and comparing the quality. But I will say, like, Muse, for what it is a brilliant device. And for the actual, we talk so much smack about it in a research setting and kind of go through this thing. But what Interaxon has been able to do, creating a $200 to $300 4-channel EEG that you can, that anybody, even a non-scientist, can, buy online, they ship it to your house, and within 10 minutes you can be viewing your own brain waves. Maybe it's not the highest grade research, blah, 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 but that you can actually do that is phenomenal. I've seen so many different 5-figure, EEG equipment, setups and different setups that cost, just a few $1,000s. And I haven't seen anything that is the same ease of use, is as cheap as Muse, and is as like readily usable for the average person that uses. And so that's kind of, I always feel like bad, because we're always just like, it's not giving me the signal that I want, or it's not doing this, but it's really a phenomenal piece of neurotech.
Yeah, I think anybody that watches my channel gets a feel that I am like a cheerleader and proponent of the technology, just because I know that the more people that use it, the more people will get interested in neuroscience, and then that'll lead them down the path of, neurofeedback meditation, which is exactly what we're doing here, or even just any other applications. I eventually, hopefully, some really amazing brain-computer interface devices as well. But, I think us as, being scientifically trained, we want to pick the thing apart to try to understand it better so that we can know its strengths, limitations, and build on it and, contribute in any way that we can. I think one of the talking points that you had in the video that I watched of you that I thought was interesting was just taking a look at the raw EEG signal of the different sensors. Would you be able to talk about like the difference between the frontal and the back sensors of the Muse? What that looks like with raw data?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a pretty big difference between the two, and you can notice that pretty just visually. You take the device out of the box, and it has these, I believe they're silver chloride, which is a more traditional type of EEG electrode metal, along that frontal kind of band. That's from a Muse 1. I think the Muse 2, and then this
Gold and Muse 2.
Yeah, it's something like that. I have a Muse 1, which is the best for research, I think. But it has those metal frontal ones, but then it goes back and it has these kind of conductive silicone ones on the ears, which was something that threw me for a loop because I never actually heard of conductive silicone being used in an EEG fashion for like a signal acquisition thing. And it's a very, again, it's something that it fits very well. It's easy to put on. You don't have to fidget with it a lot. Expensive EEG setups, you have to fidget with a lot. But the conductive silicone sensors are very indiscriminate, right? They seem to be picking up electrical sources from all kinds of different areas. And so when you look at the raw EEG, you can see the frontal bands are much more traditional that I would expect from an EEG. They fall within that, 10, 20 microvolt kind of variation. It seems pretty clean. I see some things that are pretty reminiscent of what I'm seeing on more traditional setups. But then when you look at the temporal sensors that are made of conductive silicone, it's like the 75 microvolt deviation. They're really prone to this sense of like noise. And so noise is basically just anything that is our non-neural data that is getting picked up. And so we have a lot of people that will meditate in different parts of their home, in different areas, with different setups and different things, and they'll actually get their temporal sensors picking up all kinds of weird things on one side. If there's, power lines or something, it seems to pick up a ton of that. Or just anything that is, it's very interesting, and it's very, it's almost a little chaotic as a neuroscientist because there are so many electrical frequencies and energies just through our environment, from microwaves to power lines to cell phones and stuff like that. And when you have something that's very, very sensitive to picking up stuff from all directions, it really confuses a lot of the data. It really adds a whole lot of gobbledygook into the data that really just like masks what you're really after. And so, one of the things that I'm currently planning is a study on Reiki at a distance that I wanted to do with the Muse Headband, which is really cool that I could do that, in this kind of quarantine times without ever having to leave my apartment and stuff like that, which is amazing. But, going through and evaluating the device and seeing how I would write up my results in the future using Muse, I came to the conclusion that I was only really comfortable getting data from the frontal electrodes and putting that out there, because the temporal stuff is just so messy that, it's like I don't want to show another neuroscientist that data. They'd be like, what are you even doing? This is like so mired in unknown that it's very difficult for a scientist to draw very concrete truths from that. And so we have to limit how much interpretation we do from that temporal analysis, because it's really hard to say what's really in there.
Yeah, I think you touched on another thing I wanted to ask you about was, we talked about raw EEG patterns that maybe some people have seen those graphs. I think a lot of people have seen the fast Fourier transform graphs where they've got the different alpha, beta, delta, gamma, theta on the graph doing their thing. But one of the graphs that I feel like is not shared very often in the community is the power spectral density graphs. Would you be able to touch on that and kind of explain what data you can actually get from looking at that and what you've actually seen on, you touched on it a little bit, what you're seeing from power lines and stuff on the Muse data, but if you could dive into that a little bit, I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the PSD, or the power spectrum densities, are a particular kind of frequency analysis that I tend to use. And so kind of what it is, so we know the FFT, right? The FFT will take that complex signal and break it down into the separate brainwaves. What a PSD does is, imagine you have a 5-minute meditation sequence. A PSD will chop that up into, let's say, 2 to 4 second chunks. Each chunk kind of overlaps each other about 50% of the way. And so that long time period is divided up into lots and lots and lots of little couple second chunks. Each of those chunks has an FFT that is done on it. Then all those FFTs are then averaged together to produce the PSD. And so the PSD will have basically, on the vertical axis, it'll show you how powerful a signal is. And then on the horizontal axis, it'll show you from 0 to 100 hertz. So you can go, oh, the 7 hertz signal, how powerful was that? Or the 12 hertz signal, how powerful was that? And so you can begin to get these, it's almost like these kind of thumbprint kind of, for each person, you can get this very unique spectrum of what the power balance of brainwaves was. Is this a theta dominated state? Is there theta going through the roof? Is this a very much an alpha dominated state? Is this a high gamma state? And so that very much gives you the ability to kind of both begin to qualify and quantify what brainwaves are present and how powerful are each of those brainwaves in a very specific way.
One of the things I wanted to ask you with, I know you've worked with some very accomplished meditators, people that have been meditating for decades and decades, mm-hmm. and there's been findings on the power spectral density graphs, as well as fast Fourier transform, as well as any EEG data that you can see from them. Would you mind walking us through what you've seen in the past and what most piques your interest these days in regards to that data?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I would say at the outset, alpha was the first port of call. I would say alpha is, it has many functions, but it is, one of what you may call the dominant states that we enter when we begin to enter a deeply relaxed meditation. And so increases in alpha waves are most prominently seen and studied in Vipassana, stillness, Zen, any kind of that deep, quiet, almost like the more traditional meditation styles that people are familiar with. And so you can imagine that deep, relaxed kind of brain is that alpha kind of brain. And so that's it's one that many people tap into. It's very common, and it also seems to be the beginning stages. And so we have this thing called the alpha bridge, to where it seems to be when you initially relax, it's a very alpha state. Then that alpha state allows you to bridge into deeper states. And so you have to first kind of settle yourself, calm your mind, calm your body. And once you're on that, even playing field, you can then dive down deeper into whatever techniques or whatever specific practice it is you're doing, or double down and go very deep into that, clear alpha flow state. And that's another thing as well, when people talk about flow state, whether in sports or activities or whatever it is, that's a very alpha mediated phenomenon.
Yeah, and I know you were talking about differences in peak alpha frequency that are different amongst people, right?
Yeah. And so that's so peak alpha frequency is something that's increasingly being used as like a marker, or like if we could just have a single stamp of like a person's, not state of mind, but almost like their cognitive performance or cognitive state of mind. And so a lot of people do that kind of alpha training for oh, I want to kind of train my alpha to be, as refined as possible. Therefore, I am the best, leader because I can make decisions, or I can be the most, aloof or the most relaxed person and not make emotional decisions and stuff like that. And so alpha is a tremendous target for training from that perspective. And so it's, a lot of research is now kind of coming out and being like, okay, can we use this, alpha frequency, this peak frequency between 8 and 12 hertz as a marker for, where a person is in their day, let's say, or how cognitively ready are they to engage with the task and stuff like that. And as we dive down deeper into it, it's always fascinating as well, because the complexities that are arising are intriguing. We have, the alpha, which is, 8 to 12 hertz, but some literature is actually finding and reporting that 8 to 10 hertz and the 10 to 12 hertz might be two different, what we call pacemaker sources, which is basically like this alpha and this alpha just come from different parts of the brain. Again, a high spatial or a high electrode count EEG would be able to make those kinds of claims. But that 8 to 10 hertz is that, cortical thalamo type of attentional circuit. The thalamus deals a lot with a lot of our sensory. It deals a lot with everything, but it deals a lot with our sensory inputs and kind of integrating them in, in the center of our brain. And so that's kind of one target for the 8 to 10, hertz alpha, if people want to train that as a meditative attentional type of a thing. Or the 10 to 12 seems to be more of a cortical to cortical interaction. So reaching back and finding memories and bits of ideas and then bringing them back to the front to synthesize them and stuff like that. And so, yeah, alpha is a very, very interesting one in that it seems to be that bridge that allows people to dive deep into other states of consciousness. But as we dive deeper into alpha as scientists, it's getting even more and more complex, all the different alpha currents that exist simultaneously in the brain.
What else has been coming up lately in your research? I know gamma has been a topic of discussion as well.
And so that's probably the most interesting thing, is this theta gamma dance that kind of occurs, the gamma particularly. And that was actually what really got me super interested in the raising our vibration community, a little over a year ago, was that, Kevin and Stephen are examples of gentlemen that have done, over 3 decades, I think, of meditation individually. And they, bought the Muse and kind of strapped it on and started producing some of their, meditations. And they have this very, very interesting phenomenon where when they tap into the part of their meditation that is, I guess I would say, highly energetic, that is very part of that, that Kriya Yoga, that energy up the spine into the brain and then up and above and beyond, and having that lead into this state of like non-dual consciousness, basically like a sense of oneness, right? Very, very spiritual, very Buddhist kind of Hindu kind of stuff. Very interesting. And that coincides with this big high beta gamma spike as well, which is something that is not really seen in a lot of people in really any kind of capacity. It was something that, we looked at as neuroscientists and we're like, what on earth is going on? And so actually when gamma was first being seen and studied, and we started having these high gamma people, there was actually a debate in the community, and it's still somewhat there, whether gamma is actually a thing or not, because it was so rare up until that point. And we also need, higher degrees of hardware to study it and so on and so forth. But it was always, gamma has always been denoted the mystery band of like, what is this? Like, where is it from? What's it doing? Why is it showing up in people that have meditated for, years and years? And what is it doing in their brain, and how is it different? And so that really, really piqued my interest. And so in the past decade, we've had a ton of work on, Antoine Lutz did, I think a famous 2004 study about the high amplitude gamma meditators. And what we've kind of discovered is that gamma is like this binding frequency. It's almost like, I consider it like a shepherd, or it can exist in this shepherding capacity or coordinating capacity amongst the other brainwaves. You can imagine that since it is a lot quicker than all the other brainwaves, that gives it the ability to cross-talk between them in a very kind of valuable, speedy way, and to coordinate activity, maybe between a couple of different regions, and to kind of sync the neural activity and brainwave activity up in a more seemingly whole brain way than what is previously seen and studied in EEG, which is much more discrete parts of the brain and stuff like that. And so it's been extremely interesting how they've been able to tap into that and to, basically, the analogy that I use is, people ask, so what's the difference between like them and me? What's the difference between like this high gamma brain and my brain, or what? And the analogy that I always use is like the gym, right? It's, imagine, your average Joe in the street, and then compare him to like the Arnold Schwarzenegger Olympic bodybuilder, the guys that have been, every day going in and working on their body, and their bodies, their muscles, and your physiology is set up and trained and refined in such a peak way that is very different operating than the average Joe person. And so with these high-end meditators, they're basically like, the Olympians of the neural world, to where their brain is extremely kind of toned up, and it gives them this ability to not only have excellent and very interesting things happen during their meditation, but it actually leads to their brains being different throughout the whole rest of their kind of waking or resting lives. And so that's kind of how we see not just state differences with these high-end meditators, with this gamma and kind of what it's doing, but also trait differences in that, they have those very, very healthy brains, and that they have that high gamma that is coordinating a lot of different brain waves, and it's a very coordinated, hierarchical, kind of refined system. And from my perspective, that's what kind of gives them the ability to kind of go through life and not feel as much stress as the rest of us, to be able to maintain very calm breath rates, even in the face of our modern times and stresses and stuff like that. It's whatever is happening in their meditation is also leading back and having phenomenal effects on the entirety of their brains functioning, no matter what it is doing, waking, resting, or meditating. And so that gamma is a very, very interesting thing. And it's interesting as well because, I almost want to like watch this interview a decade from now and see how far we've come, because right now we're in the thick of it. I can hypothesize about, what gamma, I can see where gamma is, kind of what it's doing. I can begin to hypothesize over its functions and what it seems to be doing from the data. But we're really just now getting to grips with the fact that this high gamma thing does exist. And neuroscientists are now really getting to grips with meditation and finding out that it is this extremely significant way of altering your internal physiology, especially the nature of your brain. And so it seems almost, every month or every year or every week almost, a new paper comes out that we're like, oh, this is another little piece of the puzzle. This high-end meditator, this gamma, this this alpha bridge, this thing is kind of slowly but surely kind of coming together.
One of the things that they described that I know I've experienced myself is that after they're able to sort of raise energy levels, through Kriya Yoga and other techniques, that they're able on the other side to get into a deeper meditation after they've done that exercise. Were they able to demonstrate that for you? And can you talk about what happens on the other end of that after they get the spike in beta and gamma? Are they in a deeper alpha state? Do they have a lower alpha peak frequency? What's coming out from the data on that?
And so the data seems to be showing this like deep theta state, which is interesting. And so I've seen it in a couple of those high-end meditators to where they actually completely almost forgo the alpha and are almost 100% in that theta kind of a range. The thing with, alpha and it being used as this very common metric, as I mentioned before, is that it's used in that way because it's so consistently present. Like almost everybody you do a PSD on will typically have, in an eyes closed resting scenario, will have that very traditional alpha peak. And you can almost very much count on that. Like the PSDs have a very predictable shape to where, there's that low powered muscular activity or the high powered muscular activity, and then it kind of delves down into a lower theta, and then it rises up to have an alpha peak, and then it goes down and you have some beta and gamma following from that. But what I see in these high-end meditators is that there's no alpha peak, which is very curious to me. But the peak where all that power exists comes all the way down to that 7 to 8 hertz range. Which is interesting as well, because one of the fundamental funding harmonics of our Earth and our ionosphere and stuff like that are the Schumann frequencies. So basically like the Earth's frequencies. And the base Schumann wave of the Earth is about 7.8 hertz. And the most commonly on average, I would see people tending towards a 7.6 type of range. Plus or minus, analytical errors or whatever. But that is very curious to me, and that is also kind of unique to me in that why and how is this so deep, and is that what it is? Is this delta, is this theta indicating depth? Because traditionally, if I saw that same theta, which is coming from the frontal regions as well, and if I saw that in a normal, non-meditating person, I would be like, oh, this person is very much engaged in a working memory task, or is very much, the frontal part of their brain is very much engaged and is dealing with something. That part of the brain seems to be engaged in meditation. However, the person does not perceive that it's, they're not dealing with something. They're not like having a working memory task. They're not like, loading themselves up with trying to memorize numbers or anything like that. And so it's a very interesting thing to be able to try and hypothesize over. Does the frontal theta, which neuroscience has previously elucidated as being, a memory or even maybe a cognitive fatigue type of function, is that existing in the same context in a meditation? And the answer somewhat seems to be no. It seems meditation almost seems to be a unique kind of state of consciousness that seems to have features that are unique to itself. And that's also a thing when we're looking at these high-end meditators and studying them, is to be very open-minded, because it's very non-traditional kind of what I'm seeing.
One of the things that's got me thinking is on some of those neurofeedback protocols, like if you're using MindLift, for instance, it kind of encourages you to limit theta at some times. And my interpretation of that is it doesn't want you getting too drowsy, especially if you're doing like an attention exercise or something like that. But like an expert meditator, after they get that peak and then get down into theta, it could be, similar brainwave frequency patterns that the EEG is picking up, but a completely different state of mind, depending on like what progress you've gone through that.
Exactly. And that's, it's almost like we'll have to not rewrite the book, but write a new book for meditation on EEG and brainwaves, stuff like that. It's the same is true with the gamma. So the gamma is most typically observed in the occipital cortex. So the back of the brain is where this high beta gamma is coming from. That's typically like the visual cortex area of the brain, or it's very traditionally like, oh, visual tasks will activate this kind of back area. And then so we see this high beta gamma phenomenon, in those very interesting peak moments during meditation, for those high-end meditators. And then we have to ask, is this a visual thing? Maybe partly, or is this not maybe getting visual cortex information, but is perhaps getting information from the precuneus or the posterior cingulate cortex, and areas of the brain that we understand to be associated with our sense of self, our sense of identity, our sense of like separation of, oh, this is the me that exists that is separate from this other person, and we are also separated by an environment that exists in kind of 3D space. And so there's a lot of those parts of the brains that are being increasingly discovered to contain those almost egocentric portions, those portions that describe this is the I and that's the them, and this is how we define our reality, and almost keep a sense of like sanity and self. But I would suspect, and it seems pretty logical, that with the high-end meditators reporting this non-dual consciousness, this unification, that perhaps this high beta gamma is modulating and refining or somehow coordinating activity in those kind of egocentric, kind of 3D space, sense of self, kind of posterior portions of the brain, and then amplifying that, toning it down, or maybe connecting it in a different way or to a different network that alters its connectivity or function, and causes the person to perceive something much different. And it's very, in addition as well, actually, to add to that, the other area of interest that some of the theta and also the high beta gamma occurs is in the frontal areas. The frontal areas are like the executive decision. So it's another part of your brain that you could consider the you part of your brain, or a part of, your personality or sense of self and stuff like that. And so it's very interesting how the two areas of the brain that seem to be affected the most by these very deep meditations seem to be the areas that are associated with our sense of maybe division or oneness or ego or separation, and how that lines up also with the Hindu or Vedic or Buddhist scriptures on saying, hey, we are all one, and that's what this nirvana thing is all about, is really realizing that oneness. And so that kind of comes full circle for me in a kind of satisfying way, and very much piques my curiosity to be like, is this kind of what this high beta gamma theta thing is in the frontal part and also in the back of the brain? And that's my hypothesis, and that's kind of what I've been working on. But again, ask me in a few years and we'll see kind of where a lot of those theories are kind of going to end up. It's endlessly fascinating.
It is amazing, and I can't fathom where we'll be at in 5, 10, or even 20 years. And one of the things that I like to talk about on this channel and look into and talk to people about is the technology itself, and what it might be capable of. And you, as a neuroscientist, what would be your ideal device, or have you looked at a new technology that's coming? Is there anything that gets you really excited about being able to see a lot more data that would be helpful in uncovering these mysteries?
So I'd say there's not one product yet that I'm like, that I'm waiting for, or I'm very eager for. I can't speak too much of it, but on the back end, with some of the work with the high-end meditators and the Raising Our Vibration community and company and stuff like that, I'm working with some other companies around the world. That is the question that we're asking ourselves, and also these hardware and software developers, to be like, hey, we have the knowledge and the interest and the application to develop, what would be the Muse equivalent, but not for neurofeedback, but for more of the research oriented type of thing. I would love something that, is easy to strap on. Imagine, something that's easy to, just strap on your head like a Muse, and you can, connect it to an iOS or just an app and be able to immediately get brainwaves. That to me is phenomenal. And that's what I really loved about kind of what Muse does for society, is that it really gives everybody the opportunity to kind of be that consciousness explorer and to dive in. But also for me as a neuroscientist, it gives me the ability to access so much more data. EEG studies are traditionally pretty hard to get data for, or you get, a lot of data, but on only a couple of people, or it takes a long time to recruit people, or, whatever it is, or there's maybe databases of meditators, but they're, very high value databases. So only the companies that make them want to use them and stuff like that. And so that to me is what I loved about Muse and kind of what it does in the heart mind and raising our vibration in the Muse community, to be like, anybody can like have their go at submitting data. And that brings, as you mentioned, it brings a lot of people interested into our field, and which is amazing, to really get the word out there that this is your brain, this is kind of what it does, and here's how you can modulate it, and here's how you can really fundamentally change your life in very non-invasive ways using really simple techniques that dramatically change your interior physiology. And so if I was to look at what I really love in a future device, I really love that aspect of everybody being able to submit their brain data if they would like, or get a better look at their brain data if they would like. And again, I'd mentioned a little bit previously that I'd want to do this study on remote Reiki. And that is something that I'm planning, that I want to do, as I mentioned again, like not leaving my apartment, right? So being able to actually conduct an EEG study, get EEG data, and get some really interesting looks at people's brains, but have us all be in our little bubbles around the world and not have to, be like, okay, like wash your hair before you come into the lab, and then come into the lab an hour before, and we'll get you prepped up, we'll get you suited up, and go through that whole EEG rigmarole that's I'm more used to from the more research side of things. And so, yeah, really interested to see what the whole consciousness hacking, neurofeedback kind of community, what that hardware is going to be in the next couple of years, because it's anybody's game at this point. Muse was one of the first ones out there, but cat's out of the bag now.
Yeah. I mean, it's a proof of concept thing, and groups like you guys are in are just doing amazing things. And I really appreciate you sitting down and talking brainwaves with me, Kiefer.
Oh, my pleasure, Cody. Yeah, I'm always, I love to ramble. Anybody that knows me knows I love to ramble about brainwaves. So anytime anybody can get me cornered off, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, and your website is great. And, where can people find more that you've written? We kind of went back and forth on this interview. Maybe a lot of concepts were thrown out there that people would love to dive into deeper. And I think you've done a good job, even with the amount of concept that you have on there so far, mapping things out for people. Where can they go to learn more about what you're doing?
Absolutely. So I just started a new website that I'm working on. So if people are interested, they can go to ponderbrain.com. So PONDER brain.com. And that's just a site where I have some of my articles. I'm going to be putting more, data and, a lot of the stuff that I mentioned today and then I'm working on in the future. That's kind of my goal, is to have that be the kind of central area where people can go to get a good read on that stuff.
All right. Sounds great. I'll send them there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cody.